My name is Francis Doyle. I'm studying for the priesthood at Kenrick Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri, and am enrolled in a class called Islam Through Catholic Eyes. The purpose of the class is to gain a better understanding of Islam, since it is one of the fastest growing religions in the world. In this class, we hope to share our better understanding of Islam with the Catholic faithful and others in order to promote a greater, more productive dialogue with the Muslim community to dispel commonly held misconceptions of their faith. The greatest hope is that this will lead to a long-term, peaceful coexistence. This project has three aspects. First, what are some common misconceptions of Islam? Second, why do such misconceptions exist? And thirdly, what can be done to dispel these misconceptions? I interviewed people with various perspectives on the issue in order to gain some insight and hopefully some answers.
That Muslims are terrorists.
That the Muslims are terrorists.
My first impression about Islam was very positive.
I did notice certain things about Muslims, some positive and some negative.
They used to call them camel jockeys. They used to call them towel heads.
That Islam is an Arab religion.
Most people either expect them to be a foreigner.
In Iraq, anyway, really disliked Jews.
The television programs of the day, the sitcoms and what have you, the Arabs were always portrayed as kind of bumbling, fumbling.
Maybe like the sexist misconceptions.
The religion is judged by the action of the Muslims.
I also worked with Iraqi Christians, and they would tell me, Matt, you can enjoy working with them and you can be friendly, but never trust Muslims.
A lot of times they get you mixed up with other religions.
Probably one of the most common misconceptions is that we don't believe in Jesus. And this is far from being the truth.
You know, Islam doesn't condone terrorism in any way, shape, or form.
As Brother Dawood said, it's two-sided. One, the Muslims are not doing their job to propagate the religion in its proper way.
I think a lot of it just has to do with lack of education.
I think a large part of that, too, is with the American public's unwillingness or laziness and lack of interest in learning more about these people. It's too easy to stereotype.
Well, I think because the world is, there's so many things going on in the world, you see so many different kinds of people, that in order to get through life, we engage in what philosophers and sociologists and people call typifications. So you take a shorthand way of categorizing folks so that if you had to process each individual person that you saw as an individual, you would probably never get directly outside of your own car.
I think like a lot of people after 9/11, that was the first time that I really ever noticed Muslims.
Since 9/11, you know, all of my image has changed, that they're terrorists and they're violent and they're trying to solve the problem with the war and the violence.
When Timothy McVeigh bombed the federal building, we didn't say Christians are terrorists, but when a Muslim bombed the federal building or the World Trade Center, it said Muslims are terrorists, not just the individuals who perpetrated that crime.
A lot of people believe that there's a kernel of truth in stereotypes, but because we take a trait and assume that everybody in a group has that trait, it's false, because you can't claim that everybody in a group has any particular trait.
Sometimes, you know, people go overboard. Other Muslims will go overboard in blaming the Muslims, and then some Muslims will go overboard in blaming the non-Muslims and say Muslims are completely innocent. Usually I think the truth lies somewhere in between.
I think that our perception of Islam has been dictated to a very large degree by what we see with regard to suicide bombings.
I also started reading the Quran when I was over there, and that made me nervous because I within the Quran, within some of the verses, they say that the infidel, which is the Christian or the Jew, is to be put to death, put into slavery, or converted.
Stereotypes often tend to go in waves because we tend to engage in what we call dichotomous thinking. It's us versus them. And during the Cold War era, it was us versus the communists. So then the Cold War ends, and there's no them for us. So them becomes terrorists.
9/11 in 2001, all the media in North America all start going against Islam people or Muslim.
Most of what we're getting today with regard to the Arab world and the Muslim world is through the news.
Some might even say that some things in the media are purposely being misconstrued.
Well, I hate to say that any news organization would manipulate, but I think that probably happens, and again, whether it's a conscious effort or not.
Some cases where terrorists have been Middle Eastern people who are practicing Muslims, and then the media reports that this is part of the Islamic Jihad, and so people assume everybody who is Islam believes that that the U.S. is evil, and everybody who is Islam is a potential terrorist, or everybody who practices Islam hates the United States.
I'm saying that the things that they choose to show are the things that relate to a very few of this particular group, and that therefore that's all we see, and as a result of that being all we see, we ascribe those qualities, whatever they may be, to the much larger group.
That was one thing that I noticed when I was over there watching the news. We had 60% of the Iraqis go out and vote. And, that maybe got 2 days worth of coverage. Whereas Abu Ghraib prison received 6 months of coverage, and it still is brought up to this day.
If 98% of the Muslim world goes about its business every day and disavows the extremists and doesn't want to be a part of any of this violence that's taking place, we're ignoring that in favor of the 2% that are conducting the violence, because that sells more newspapers, it sells more toothpaste.
To add to that, acts that are so horrific like 9/11 that are tied to people, sadly, who practice Islamic faith, then that really, really reinforces people's stereotypes. And it's hard to get past that.
Like when they're showing the Osama bin Laden, and those kind of photos, it's kind of, especially when you don't have much knowledge and when you have a strong stereotype in your mind, that kind of things like change your mind. And
nothing fills the screen of a television set better than a fire or an explosion. And, people just going to work and going about their business every day does not sell that toothpaste or sell the newspaper.
Everyone's responsible. I mean, everyone plays a part. Once you hear of news, as Doyle said, you shouldn't just accept it. You should go research it. So when we hear misinformation, it's upon us as Muslims to try to clarify it, even if the media doesn't give us the forum to do so. We should try. And I doubt Muslims are down there beating on the newspaper and television news to clarify what they heard.
Communication, education are the most important things.
Well, I think they've got to do more more diverse programming, and really do what they can to educate the American public on what's going on with this group.
I think education is always key. And contact, what we find is intergroup contact, where people are working together on a common task, tends to really reduce negative stereotyping. But it has to be, the contact can't be fleeting. It can't be an hour worth of, let's all get together and be friends. It has to be something that's relatively ongoing, or the task has to be fairly important, or the duration simply has to be a long-term duration, so that you get to know people not just because we're all working on this task, but you get to know people beyond that. You get to see the complexity of who they are as individuals.
And on occasion, I'll hear an individual Muslim come out and speak against violence, but for the most part, I have not heard any imams come out and speak loudly against violence. And I think that adds to the distrust for people, because people say, well, how come they're not speaking out against it loudly? You know, so there, to me, I think it leaves an in for more distrust, because people wonder, well, if they're not speaking out loudly against it, are they part of the problem?
If they say Muslims believe and they say and do certain things, okay, well, let me go to, you know, let me go see it. Like, let's say they believe and do certain things, you know, well, I'm going to go to a mosque and see if that happens, or I'm going to go to their website and see if that happens, or I'm going to pick up their book and see if it coincides with what, you know, with what's going on.
We used to have a radio show here in St. Louis, and I recommend other communities all throughout the United States to try to have a radio show, to try to have a maybe public TV show on the public cable channel, public access cable channels if they're able to.
Everyone seemed to agree that education is the key to reducing the tendency to stereotype Muslims. One of our instructors, Dr. Sebastian Mahfoud, explained why Kenrick Seminary decided to offer a course on Islam.
In the year 2003, Kenrick Glennon Seminary came up with a new component to its strategic plan. We put in global vision goals. And part of our global vision goals were in response to the Association of Theological Schools accrediting standards, but also in response to the fact that we understood that the church in the modern world requires seminarians and future priests who understand what global vision is all about.
How many people do you know in this country who could tell you what the source and the origin of the dispute between the Israelis and the Palestinians is? I would say a relatively small number. And it's critical. It's critical to understand before you can solve the problem. You've got to understand it.
A lot of our misconceptions and myths about the other occur because we don't have effective dialogic structures in place. We don't have opportunities necessarily that we perceive as opportunities to engage the other in mutually beneficial conversation.
The contact, it can be organized without necessarily being required. So the idea of interfaith prayer services, as an example, where people are going and doing what they are used to doing, but you're including a wider group of people who are together seeking the same goal, and then or maybe have or interfaith-based efforts at disaster relief or something like that, where people are working toward a common goal and they have contact with each other, they talk with each other as they are working, so that it's not, let's sit down and work out our differences, because that's really difficult to force people to do. But instead, put people in a situation where they're going to see what they have in common almost come out just in the natural course of interaction, as opposed to being instructed.
And many times we give lectures at Washington University, St. Louis University, UMSL, military bases. We go to high schools, elementary schools, and we give lectures in different atmospheres about what Islam is. And many times it's we attend the Catholic view on Islam at your church, and people see us and meet us and get our phone numbers in the hallway, and then they come in like that.
As a group, people can sort of work it out in conversation with each other. Oh, okay, so maybe we're more alike than we thought, and they're still reducing the dissonance, and we're still being able to realize that yes, there are some extremists, just as there are in any group. But to work that out with each other, then it helps to be less individually threatening.